1 Samuel chapter 17, David and Goliath. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shema. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left the flock with the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage, and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on the sword over the tunic and tried walking around, because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and, with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield-bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the scabbard. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shuarim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put the Philistine's weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, O king, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" David asked him. David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem."
Well, that's a long chapter. And thank you to Fiona for reading it to us. And I hope you stuck with it. It is, of course, a familiar story, possibly, with the exception of the Christmas story, perhaps the best-known Bible story around. Indeed, our sports commentators have adopted David and Goliath story as a kind of metaphor for competitions where one side's either stronger than the other or weaker than the other. I'll make no reflection on last night's result as to whether that was a David and Goliath contest or not. Goliath, on his own, of course, has been used to christen some items that are considered big and powerful. So if you visited Belfast and seen one of these great big yellow cranes there, one's called Goliath, I think the other one's called Samson, so you get the picture. And if this doesn't give you kind of nightmares, there's even a South American bird-eating spider called Goliath, which I'm sure you wouldn't want to huckle out the bath of a morning. But maybe as Christians, or as folks who know the story, we can be a little bit guilty perhaps of consigning the story to that part of our brain where we file things that we know really well, and we kind of skim over it. And we think, well, I know this story, I know what happens, I know the outcome, and I can probably understand a little bit about what the purpose of the story is. So we kind of skim over it. Now, when I do that, I've always found that when I go back and actually read the story in detail, God always says something to me that perhaps he wouldn't have done had, well, I'd not read the story and he hadn't had the opportunity to speak to me. So I hope that's the case for you this morning as we come to this familiar story. You can approach it from a number of perspectives. It's a historical story, so you can approach it from a historical perspective. The Bible here is giving us a bit of historical narrative, a record of a period in Israel's history. You may remember, if you were around this time last year, we were all kind of locked up in our houses, we studied the period just before this, when Samuel, the judge, was in charge. And the Israelites were fighting the Philistines then as well. The Philistines were a very powerful, advanced nation. They were very aggressive, and they were completely pagan. And we read there of the people's desire. We want a king, they said. We want a king. Just like all these other nations have got a king, we want one. We want a king who, they said, interestingly, will go out before us and fight our battles. And to begin with, Saul, who was their first king, was a success. He was a great leader. He was a warrior king, and he did win battles. But as his success grew, so his pride grew. And whenever success and pride walk hand in hand down the street in our lives, we tend to find that our faith and trust in God drops off. And that's what's happened with Saul. So he's still the king, but he's not much of a leader. And he's certainly not fighting any battles. And crucially, as we heard from last week, God has rejected him as king, and David has been appointed and anointed as his replacement. But this isn't just a historical story. It's a Bible story. And so there's another perspective you have to approach it from, a spiritual perspective. Because here is a record of how God deals with his people, helping them to possess the land that he has given them. And of course, they face opposition from other peoples who have their own gods that they're following. But this spiritual perspective is bigger than just this incident. Because what we are being shown here is, if you like, a lived-out illustration of the great battle that wages each and every day in the life of a Christian. What the Apostle Paul would describe as the great wrestling match with rulers and authorities and cosmic powers and spiritual forces of evil. And Goliath, you see, stands, if you like, in a long line of forces. Oh yes, he's flesh and blood, but he represents, you see, those gods with a small g who seek to defy the living God. But there's another perspective that perhaps you view this story from, the personal perspective. Because as with all stories, we imagine ourselves in the scenario, don't you? We try to translate it into our lived experiences. So perhaps we see parallels in the regular battles we have with sin and temptation and our failure to follow God. And maybe it feels a bit like we've got a Goliath to face. We get up in the morning and want to live for God, and before we've got our feet in the floor, we feel we've let him down, and it just seems so hard. And so we see ourselves maybe as David. We go out and we sling away as best we can, and yet somehow we must keep missing, because Goliath's still there, challenging all we believe and hold dear, perhaps making us afraid. Now we'll come back to that thought before we're done. But so you know where we're heading, I simply want to look at this incident and the difference that David made, and then try and draw out some principles that I hope will help us as we seek to live for God each day. I can imagine, Jeremy Bowen arriving on this battlefield, wearing his regulation blue BBC health and safety flak jacket, which doesn't ever look to me as if it's going to save him from much, and a kind of white helmet. And he describes for us that up on one hill are the Israelite army. And they're not a big army. They're not terribly well equipped. They've not got much in the way of armor, much in the way of weapons. Don't look particularly strong. Don't look like a bunch of winners. And up the other hill, you've got the Philistines. They're much bigger, more powerful, very technologically advanced. They've got weapons up there that no one else has got. They've got the technology. They look like the winners. But the battle hasn't even started yet. Not a shot has been fired. Not that they'd be firing any shots. We haven't got gunpowder yet, but you know what I mean. There's a complete stalemate. No side really taking the initiative except for Goliath from Gath, who we learn in verse 16, twice a day for 40 days has been coming out to the battlefield with his shield bearer, who you have to feel a wee bit sorry for, hurling insults as best he can at the Israelite forces. And of course, we're given this detailed description of him. He's a huge, arrogant bull of a man, and he embodies the godless challenge to the living God. And it seems almost single-handedly he's had the effect of paralyzing Saul and his army with fear and dread, we're told in verse 11. It's got so bad that Saul has offered a bribe to anyone willing or daft enough to take Goliath on. You're going to get a heap of money. You're going to get a princess. And you're going to get tax exemption for life. I have to think that's quite a good deal. Never been offered a princess, you would think. That must tempt a few people, and yet there has been no long line of volunteers willing to have a go. You can imagine the picture. They get up every morning, put on whatever fighting gear they've got, and go to the edge of the cliff and look down into the valley. Oh yeah, here he comes again. Same man, yep, look at him, huge. Oh, he's shouting the same stuff. Are you going down? Now, you must be kidding. Look at the size of him. You can go down. No. I was going to go yesterday, but, I've got this sandal rash. I kind of, I can't run as quickly as, well, you need to. God's people, dressed for war every day, and yet neutralized on the sidelines of the battlefield, too filled with fear to contemplate fighting. Interestingly, Goliath puts his finger on their problem. In one of the insults he hurls at them in verse 8, he says, "Are you not servants of Saul?" Kind of saying, I suppose, Saul, you ought to be down here, but he's not. Are you not servants of Saul? Well, of course they are servants of Saul. But what they've forgotten is that they are also the armies of the living God. and therefore they should expect to win battles. Well, onto the scene comes David, the turning point in the story. And as we explore this part, I want you to think who David might remind you of. Because it's quite striking how very ordinary, perhaps even weak, David seems in these verses. Verses 12 through 18 introduce David to us. And there's a number of reasons there why we shouldn't really expect David to make much of a difference. We're told he's young. He's the runt of the litter. He's got 7 bigger brothers. And there he is. We're told he's a shepherd of his father's flock, almost as if that's a bit of a non-job. He's certainly too young to fight, and he's simply come to feed others. He's got on his Uber bike, and he's pedalled off to the battlefield with some bread for his brothers, and interestingly, some cheese from maybe Melis of Bethlehem to bribe the officers with, because that's always a good idea. But it's while David is there that Goliath marches out again and goes through his now well-worked routine and hurls his insults. But this time, of course, it's different because verse 23 tells us this time David heard him. David heard him. And it's too much for David. Because to David, this man is not just challenging the army. He is, in David's words in verse 26, an uncircumcised pagan who is defying the armies of the living God. And that can't be allowed to stand. And if Saul is not going to respond, then he, David, must. Now we know from last week how David has been anointed and filled with God's Spirit. And so David sees what all the others have missed. That the challenge from Goliath and the Philistines is not just about fighting a battle. This is a spiritual challenge. This is about God. Now, we hear the term living God that David uses, and we think perhaps it's just another title for God. But to the Hebrew, it meant a whole lot more. It meant that when you compared Yahweh, the Hebrew God, with all of the other non-gods, whether they were made of stone or clay or wood, there was really no contest. Yahweh was living. He was an active participant in the life of the people. He was with them. He determined outcomes. He balanced the scales of justice according to his will. Put simply, Yahweh, the Hebrew God, lived and moved with his people. And his armies had forgotten that. And so they stand paralyzed with fear, content just to look and to listen. So David proposes to go and to take Goliath on. And initially it's met with scorn by his oldest brother Eliab, who's maybe still a bit sore from not getting the anointing last week. Us oldest brothers, I'm one, we expect, a bit of pecking order in the family. And I guess Eliab thought he was a shoo-in. And it turned out that the youngest brother gets the anointing. So I reckon he's not very pleased to see David, and that certainly comes across. What are you doing down here, he says. Who you left your few sheep with? So it's not even you've got a great flock here, just a few sheep. Who have you left them with? And then he says to him, you've just come down to see the battle. Now, I have this mental picture of David rolling his eyes and going, battle? What battle? No one's doing any fighting. Then Saul is introduced to David. And his picture of David is not much better. He reckons he's too young, too green. You've never fought. This guy's been a warrior all his life. It's not going to end well, I promise you. Just don't get engaged or, you're not going home. We'll be sweeping up the bits for weeks. And Goliath, when he sees him, he sums him up instantly, doesn't he? Just from David's appearance. So he's quite a good-looking lad. At least Goliath recognised that. But he says he's like a stick I would throw for my dog. There's a picture for you. So Goliath doesn't reckon he's much competition either. You know, I do wonder if we are being introduced here to one of the great truths of the Bible about how God works in saving his people. That salvation comes, you see, when apparent power is confronted by apparent weakness. That God's work is never done by strength and might and power and skill and gift and strategies. God's work is achieved when God's power is used by God's people. Now you see that in other stories, don't you? Think of Gideon. Earlier on in the history, he's fighting another people. He's fighting the Midianites, and he's got an army of 32,000. That's a no bad army. And God says, you've got too many. It's not a fair fight. Whittle them down. And Gideon wins with 300. I've been reading of Elijah this week. He's stuck in a cave, depressed, downhearted. He's sent as Israel's prophet, and it seems nobody's listening to him. They've all turned to Baal. And God has to say to him, it's not like that. There are 7,000 out there who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Only 7,000, you might say. That's not very many. It was enough for God. And of course, Jesus of Nazareth himself, who I hope David is beginning to remind you of. But Goliath has become such a fixture in the lives of these soldiers, they've forgotten who God is. But David points to the giant in verse 45 and tells him and anyone else who's listening who exactly God is. You're coming at me with a sword and a spear and your strength and your might. I come to you, he says, in the name of the living God, the Lord of hosts. And so the battle takes place. And it's only a couple of verses. And as every Sunday school child will be able to tell you, as David goes out with his shepherd's crook and his sling and stands up to the insults of Goliath, victory is his. He downs the giant with one stone and chops his head off because David knew the battle was the Lord's and he couldn't lose. Now, the application of the story to our lives ought not to be too hard, it seems to me, for any of us as we think about it. We know from our own lives as we try our best to live for Jesus that life just constantly seems a battle. Something's always there, it seems, to kind of trip us up in our faith, catch us out, make us fail. And we go to bed feeling desperate. Wake up in the morning a bit more optimistic and it all goes horribly wrong again. It seems as if victory eludes us. And so maybe, and I've done this, rather than risk defeat or death, if you like, we go up on the hillside and we just look down. Maybe content to put up with the fact that there is people there challenging God and his honor, rather than bothering to engage in the fight. So maybe from this story there are some principles for us to think about. The first one is this: I think we need to be certain about the enemies of God, or perhaps we could word it another way. We need to be certain God has enemies. Now, we know this, of course. Our theology tells us of spiritual warfare, and as we've already thought, our lives bear testimony to past skirmishes with evil, and maybe even present skirmishes we're having as temptation rears its head. Now, it seems to me that whilst the Israelites perceived Goliath as the enemy, it was, after all, not hard to work that one out. He wasn't trying to charm them down the hill. But what they all missed, and what David recognized, was the repeated defiance of the living God. All of these non-gods, if you like, of the Philistines thought they could challenge and defeat the one true God. Apparently, when the First World War broke out, The War Ministry sent a whole pile of coded telegraphs around their empire to the British outposts that said simply, "War declared, arrest all enemy aliens in your district." And the reply was received from an African outpost that said, "I've arrested 10 Germans, 4 Frenchmen, 2 Italians, 3 Austrians, and an American. Please advise immediately who we are at war with." Who are we at war with? I suppose it's unlikely we're going to meet an obvious Goliath in our lives. I firmly believe he's out there in one shape or form. But in our own hearts and lives, I think Satan works in a more subtle way. He's a liar, he's a deceiver, he's a disguiser, he's a schemer. And so he'll wait and he'll search and he'll watch. He'll look for the best time to attack, when you're at your weakest perhaps, when you're at your most vulnerable. And so knowing that ought to drive us to prayer, to our Bibles. So like David, we can easily spot the times that the enemy is at work in our lives, or indeed in society of which we are a part. And remember, too, that at stake here in that fight is the honor and glory of God's name in a world that defies him. So we need to be certain God has enemies. Secondly, we need to be confident where deliverance lies. I wonder, as David I was going to say marched out, but he wasn't a soldier, so he wouldn't march. However a shepherd walks, I don't know, one leg short than the other because of the hills, who knows, but out with his staff, shepherd's crook and his wee sling. I wonder if, people up in the hills looking down were saying to themselves, who on earth does he think he is? What on earth's going on? Look at him. He's got no armor. He's got no weapons. What's he doing? What's he doing at that river? Stones against Goliath. This is not, you can see them almost going, not going to end well, this one. Someone better tell Eliab. But David, you see, his perspective was different. It didn't matter who he was. What mattered was who God was. And really, from the moment that David is introduced to us in this story, you get this unmistakable picture of someone with confidence and courage. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? How dare he defy the armies of the living God? And so the question comes to us, doesn't it? If it's not in his experience of fighting, because David's never fought anybody, where does his courage or confidence come from? And if it's not in his armor, because he's not wearing any, where does that confidence come from? And if it's not in the latest weapon, he's got the best sword that Amazon can sell, the one that no one else has got, because he hasn't, where is his courage coming from? Well, the answer he's already given to Saul, the king, in verses 34 to 37. It comes from his past experience of a God who delivered him. Oh, sure, the odd lion and bear are perhaps easier opponents than Goliath's going to be. But David's point is this, that if God is concerned enough, to save a little lamb from a flock, how much more concerned will he be to ensure his people are delivered? And one of Satan's strategies, of course, is to try to entice us to simply operate in our own abilities, to get up in the morning and think, yep, I can do this, no bother. I can win these battles with evil today. I'm feeling good about it. I wonder if we too quickly forget the times actually God has protected us, when we've experienced his sheltering word that day because we read it. Or our prayers have beaten off the attacking lion, if you like. Now, maybe as we face a bigger challenge in our lives, a stronger challenge, we need to remember God is still with us. And one of the warnings that comes through here is that these encounters come when we least expect them. David got on his bike thinking he was just going to deliver some food and he'd pedal off home as he'd done a number of days before. But this time he heard Goliath. It seems to me each day we need to be ready for the battle. We need to be confident in the resources God gives us in his word, especially. Think of Jesus facing his own Goliath of temptation out in the desert. How did he respond to each temptation? As it is written, as it is written, as it is written. So when we face the challenge, perhaps the one we didn't expect, that came from a direction we didn't think it would come from, we know how to respond because his word is fresh in our hearts and we are steeled for action through prayer. And then thirdly, we need to be concerned for God's glory. David sees what everyone else has missed, that in the challenge of Goliath there is a risk to the reputation of the Lord. That the inaction and fear of Saul and his army says something about their faith and the God they profess to follow. David is absolutely driven by a passion for the name of the living God that he knows so well. He hasn't got a concern for himself or his reputation or indeed his life. He's confident in the one thing. This battle is the Lord's, he says, and whatever happens, I can't lose. I was very challenged about that thought. How concerned I really am for the glory and the name of the Lord. Our lives are not in the line. Of course, our reputations may well be, friendships may well be, but are we concerned enough for God's name and his glory to the extent that to stand on the sidelines while God's name is defied, watching the Goliaths of today's world proclaim to us all, God is dead, and yet do nothing, say nothing? Surely cannot be. David said, I want the whole world to know there is a God in Israel. It seems, therefore, there is a role for Christians to stand up for God. But as we close, let me return to the personal perspective. Because it is a common reaction, I think, with the story to feel that we need to slip on the sandals of David and leave that place of safety that we've been hiding ourselves in and face down Goliath and desperately hope our sling work is up to par. Knowing that in our hearts, however, that we're not David, it's not going to end well, and, well, all 5 of our shots will miss the mark. So it's good, I think, to find Scripture reminding us that's not our fight. The Lord has won for us that battle. Great David's greater son, the Lord Jesus Christ, won on the cross the final and decisive battle with evil. The cross was Satan's last Goliath, you say. And Jesus won it for us because we could never win it. But that doesn't get us off the hook. Because if we don't fill David's shoes, there are other shoes we have to fill. And in verses 52 to 53, we see the picture of David standing with Goliath's head in his hands, and a great cheer from the Israelite army, and they come running down the hill, as you can imagine, through the valley and up the other side, chasing the Philistines all the way to Goliath's hometown, plundering as they went. Saul's army, finding that faith is as infectious as fear had been. What are they doing? They're living in the victory David won for them. So we too must live in the victory Christ has won for us. Oh, still the skirmishes will be there. They don't go away. We'll need to fight them each day. We'll need to face down the evil one. But we can do so confident because in Christ he is already victorious. So there are some sandals to put on, or boots to put on, those of the armies of the living God. Let's not be paralyzed with fear because we're getting our perspective on the battle all wrong. I think too often as Christians, I include myself here, we're too happy, as it were, to stand up on the hillside and we look down at the world and all that's going on and we think, well, there's nothing we can do to win. Maybe some Christians get up in the morning, they can't even be bothered to put the armour on that God gives us because they've absolutely no intention of fighting. And for some, of course, there's no question of fighting because they no longer see an enemy. Because Satan's deceived them into his angel of light trick. And there's really nothing wrong with this world. We need to fight. We need to live the victory. As if Goliath's challenge that day is still echoing down the years. As it still is. Challenging, defying the living God. We're going to close by singing that great hymn, We Rest on Thee, Our Shield and Our Defender. It was written by a lady called Edith Cherry. She died at the age of 25. She'd been crippled as a young child, suffering several devastating strokes. She couldn't get around very well. She needed 2 crutches. But she wrote wonderful poetry and wonderful hymns and great stories testifying to her faith in Christ. And these stories went round the world and impacted people. She was weak. She had nothing to offer God. And yet he used her. And so we sing her hymn. We go in faith, our own great weakness feeling, needing more each day thy grace to know. Yet from our hearts a song of triumph pealing. We rest on thee, and in thy name we go. May God bless his word to us. Let's enjoy singing this great hymn. Thank you.